Thank you for continuing to watch my course on the steps to founding a company, uh, hopefully that's of your dream or whatever reason that you have an interest. But a part of step 5 in planning your strategy is also to question yourself of what market do I want to serve? This can be a market meaning a group of people, demographics, income level. It can be types of needs you want to provide for, such as a product or a service. With a growing market right now with things like gluten-free, dairy-free, and other allergen-free food growing in demand, especially here in Houston, Texas now, most of our grocery stores have at least one section, even though a lot of them it's a small section. But we do have specialty stores where that's all they have. Are anything from gluten-free to all allergy-free food. But it's still a rather scarce thing in our local area for a restaurant to have all allergy-free dining options. I personally am allergic to eggs, soy, dairy, and gluten. Now you tell me where you can go that they don't have that in it. That means a hamburger, well, it's got mayonnaise on it. Leave off the mayonnaise, well, there's possibly the patty and definitely the bun that has egg and gluten. Okay, so you can look into things like that are markets that may be new. And I mean, we as people have been around for ages, but this is a new discovery of these allergens and how they're affecting lives and in some cases taking lives and killing people. If there's other later discoveries that you know about and you cannot find a market that serves, a business that serves that market, then it'd be a great place to start because the less competition is the better off you'll be. Now you'll always have competition, but there's a lot of industries that are newly developed, so you may not have direct competition, or you may not have as much now as you will later on when more people find out about these new discoveries and new markets that were unknown at one point. But this is an example. What market do you want to serve? Like what kind of people with what kind of needs? What kind of product or service do they need that particular market? And how competitive is it? If it's relatively new, such as my example with being allergy-free food, especially when it comes to restaurants, and not as much as grocery stores, even though it's still true, then there'd be low competition because it's relatively new and not many have evolved to fit that market to at least service it in addition to, in this case I'll say old school, which are people that are willing to eat those allergens, even though gluten is in fried food. So by eating gluten, they typically eat a lot of fried and high-fat food. But you can go into something like that, or some of the old original industries that have existed for ages, like accounting, are a lot more competitive, or lawyers. These are things that have always been and always will be. Some industries are more competitive because there is a company or two that's dominating, so it'll be a big challenge to win business from already founded, branded, well-known names, especially if it's something like Starbucks, where you think almost every mile here in Katy, Texas, the west part of Houston, Texas, every mile you go, on every corner is another Starbucks. Now that means getting a Starbucks coffee is convenient because no matter what part of town you're in, there's one just walking distance from you. But that means also that if I opened a coffee shop, I'd be competing with somebody who's got a lot of convenience, but I wouldn't always be convenient because I'd have that one location, and I may be convenient to an area that's a 1 or 2 mile radius around my company, but I'd be competing with somebody that's convenient to the entire world. Or so it seems here in Houston. That said, so it'll be harder to survive if you're in something like that where you're competing against somebody who is a big, huge leading edge that would be very hard to compete against. But that's just to consider. That doesn't mean you'll necessarily fail if you do your business plan correctly and plan right as how you can be a part of the industry, but your business be better by improving what are the flaws in the other companies. Companies that are there, what have they done wrong? What was your experience with them as customers? What do you know about them on the inside? What do you know well, you could even look on the internet and look at their reviews, because tons of people are glad to have voices on the internet about what they think of others, but they don't necessarily share it with the company itself. But you want to consider those companies' flaws, consider their pros, what's leading about them, what is so popular, customers like it, and you want to consider also the type of market you serve, meaning the low income, high income, the middle class. What group of people do you want to serve? And consider your local market. Like here in Katy, big percentage of the homes in Katy, Texas are at least $400,000. So Katy as a whole, the average income on the low end could be $150,000, but on the high end of the income could be in the millions. So in this case, being in Katy, I would ideally want to serve a higher income market because that's what I'm surrounded within. So, but if you're in another area where it's mostly low income people or middle class, whatever difference, then you'd want to focus on that market, unless you'd rather your company be somewhere far on the other side of town that does have the kind of market you want to serve. And that said, so you want to determine prices, and with that, what kind of quality of the product or service you're willing to provide, that those prices are reasonable, affordable to that market, and the quality that comes with it is acceptable and of interest based on how well they can afford and what quality they can afford in the market. Like in Katy, with everybody being on average in a house that's on average of at least $4,400, then more people are willing to pay higher price to get higher quality as they can afford it. But if you went in a impoverished income area, people would be willing to pay very minimal prices, even if that meant very minimal quality, because that's just all they could afford. And you don't want to be irrational and have high quality service in an impoverished community that either has a price too high for it, which is bound to drive you out of business, or has prices so low that you can't hire people to make up for loads you can't take, and give them reasonable pay for the quality they will provide your client. So these are factors to consider in determining what to serve, to who, and where. In addition to thinking about what you know of the market around you, what have you seen and experienced in life, and how that can be an impact on what you think needs to be done, do a research. You can search something such as alternatives to, and then whatever competitor or business you know of, and this will list our competition. You can look at the reviews on the internet, searching each of those competitions you find individually, seeing reviews. What have customers said? What are their ratings? Read their website, see what they claim versus comparing it to what the customers have said. Consider the size of the companies, consider their finances. Are they making high profits, or do they look like they're barely surviving? Like in the tutoring industry, all the way up until the early 2000s, places like Southern Learning in Huntington that have a brick and mortar building, they tell you when to come, you have to sign a contract, they tutor 3-on-1, but I always tell parents it's 1-on-1. And this, at least in the 90s and the 80s, when I was growing up, this was true. But now, everybody wants convenience. That's the one thing loved about everybody. And so being told where to go to do their tutoring, and especially with businesses like them that, at least last I knew, would tell you had to pay everything ahead of time, like a 1 year's cost of tutoring, you had to pay on day one before they'd even start. Well, they may have done changes to now accept monthly payments, but it's still, you're having to prepay, not knowing what's going to come out of it. And also not necessarily knowing that they're They're lying to you by saying it's one-on-one because they only allow parents in the back. But because of that, and now we have companies like my own that do everything from coming to you, meaning being online, where you can watch this video, or you can call us and get live person online tutoring in a classroom on Skype, or you can come to us in person, or we can come to you, whatever. We make it convenient. So companies that are still in the old school brick and mortar, that don't travel to clients, are at a point now where they're breaking even. Or when I tried to look for a tutoring job to work for my competitors, almost all of them said they're barely surviving. Some said they're reporting net losses. One guy I had an interview with at this small business called Brainy Learning Center, he said his company is 3 years old. They're in the brick and mortar business model, and he says he can't find clients. Well, there's your problem. You're not willing to be convenient to them. You want them to be convenient to you. And that's also why tutoring companies like mine are thriving, while it's a wonder some of these big companies are even still around. I know some owners of a Mathmanasium that said that they were breaking even. The same they paid out, the expenses to exist, is the same they got in, so they weren't profiting at all. They weren't losing money, but they weren't profiting. And so in your research, you need to look at factors like this in your competition to see what are they lacking. And when they lack that, how is that impacting their financials? What are other people saying about it? Looking at reviews on the internet, or talking to people, if you haven't already heard word from people you know about these other people, other businesses that are in that market. And you need to take all of this into consideration to determine how your business needs to be designed. Because the areas that are not being fed, that are needs or wants that other companies are not serving, you want to make your company one that will serve that need. If they're doing it immorally or unethically, like I said about places that I know of, at least in the 90s, would say is one-on-one tutoring, but if you go in the back, it's one teacher on 3 kids. Well, that I'm not going to guarantee is true at this time. I don't even know when you're watching this. It could be 10 years later, and there could be tons of things different about my competition. But at least as of now, January of 19, this was the last I knew. And they charge $75 an hour versus we charge $35 an hour and actually come to you or meet in person somewhere between our locations. Okay, but they also charge $75. Okay, you got to split it up front, whereas we say pay us weekly or something that we work out based on monthly, weekly, whatever that works for the client. So you want to do these things in your company, put them a part of your company that will address those needs, offer convenience, offer other things people want, and provide something that your company is improving the options available to the customers, that you believe your company will be better than your competition because, oh, they got these flaws, and instead of having those flaws, I gave my company these certain characteristics. Like I said, my tutoring company offers convenience. The competition that was the only competition at the time when I founded Ace My Course, that was the one thing they did not offer. They told you when and where to be. And it was this time or we won't do it. But these are just examples used in my business, things I know about my competition that are things you want to look for in your research. The research is very vital, because until you know what those companies are doing that are flaws, that need changing, you could end up in that same shoe. But when you find out what these flaws are, what are people saying about them? What is good? What's bad? Why do people like or not like them? You can bring those positive characteristics people do like into the characteristics of your business, but you can also bring better things into your business to make up for the flaws in your competition. But this could take you months at a time to do because you want to be very thorough. The more thorough is the more chance of success that your company will be well off, succeed, even make profits in the first year, as you've done a better job and done more thorough research. Longer it takes, the better the results in the end as far as your company making it, being made right, producing, being popular, and so forth. Just success in general. An additional part of your research is not just how many competitors you have, what are their flaws, but also consider Are they always growing? What happened to them during the Great Recession? When you look at their financials, which is public information if you're researching corporations, especially large ones like Walmart, then you want to see, how did they do in the Great Recession? Were they better off or were they worse off? Because you could be impacted to be in that same situation. If the market you're going to serve, the product is a luxury, you're more likely to hurt and suffer worse in the downtimes of the economy versus if it's a necessity like food. It's not likely you'll ever really have a low performance compared to industries that are non-necessities. So there'll be greater competition, but there'll be also more security in the fact that you'll still be making money because they're necessities if it's something like groceries. Or if it's something that's affordable to the average American that makes around $30,000, such as a fast food restaurant. Well, everybody's got to eat. Convenience is a big thing. So something like a restaurant, if you do fast food, you're more likely to make it than if you did a sit-in restaurant, especially when you're talking about prices being more affordable to the average American of $30,000 income annually versus only affordable to people that make over $100,000, or in some cases, there are restaurants that are $50 a plate. And you're talking about people probably have to be a millionaire to be willing to pay that, especially if they want to eat what's not by themselves or they want to go out pretty frequently. So you need to consider all of this. How did they do? Did they grow? If they were growing during the financial crisis and during the Great Recession, then there's something they're doing right. Because most companies were either barely getting by or they were making it by but not growing. There'll be a rare chance that some were growing. We actually produced higher sales in the time of the Great Recession because a lot more people were going back to school to try to be able to get the better paid jobs, because a lot of the jobs that were being done away with were lower pay or ones that would let go of high-skilled people and put in low-skilled to save money on wages, or the vice versa, paying high-skilled people a lot less just because they were desperate for a job. So you want to consider all of this about their financials, their business model, their ethics. How do they do in good times? How do they do in bad times? And how have they done since the Great Recession? If it's an old company that's been around for ages, like maybe 100 years, consider in the time of the Great Depression how they do after it, how they do before it. But as far as most companies, as we are developing thousands of new companies every day around the nation, at least the United States, then smaller businesses or medium-sized companies that have only been around for 10 years or less, more likely the Great Recession is the best time to consider to know, in the worst-case scenario, how would your company potentially perform. And going to the research of also the flaws of your competition or the good, how are you likely to perform compared by having those positives that make up for the flaws of your competition. Can you figure out why they suffered in the time of the recession and not doing better like how my company did? Well, address those. If you see why they suffered, make sure you use that as a way to make your company better so you won't be the one to suffer. What did they do wrong? Some grocery stores I've seen go out of business locally because they didn't change with the market. People now eat more organic food, more allergy-free food, and stuff like that in my local market, which is more common in the middle part of the U.S. than it is in, let's say, the southeast or the deep south, as some call it, where they still eat old country food like fried chicken and biscuits and gravy and all that are high in fat, cause diabetes, do whatever. Well, in Texas, that's not so much true anymore. We now have a lot more people on a lot healthier diets, even though obesity is still a problem. But those grocery stores that have ended up going out of business, or even, you may have even heard about Toys R Us when it randomly shut down. The day that they filed bankruptcy was the same day that the owner died. The stress got so bad. He was somewhere around $50 million in debt. That was why he bankrupted. But the stress got so severe it killed him. Well, but that was rather random and sudden. But if you had researched their company at the time, you'd see that their competition like Walmart now full variety of toys that they had, but lower prices. So Toys R Us went out because they kept high prices, and it did not change with the change of the market. They did not reduce their prices when they got more competition that had lower prices for the same toys. There's a grocery store in my local area that my mother knows the owner, and his locations, that being the ones that were not franchised but corporately owned, ended up going out of business because he refused to put organic food on the shelves. He refused to put gluten-free and other allergen-free food on the shelves in his grocery store. He said, well, this is what's been around forever, and I'm not willing to change. Well, when the market changes, you got to change, or you'll be the one going out of business. Your business should be an ever-evolving model through regular research to see how changes are needed over time, and not just research to see how should you develop it in the beginning. Because that not refusal to evolve with the changing market is what ran Toys R Us and Randall's grocery store out of business. So that said, research every piece and part in the good economy, in the bad economy. How'd your competition do? Where did they mess up? Take all of this into consideration, which this too should be taking you 3 months or something to do the step 6, the step 5. It should take you quite a while because you got a lot to consider, especially if you're in a market, in an industry that has been around for ages, like I said, accounting or legal services and all that other. Like a grocery store is a relatively new thing when you consider that 100 years ago they didn't have that. People were growing products on their farms, or exchanging with neighbors because maybe they had cattle and the neighbor had plants, like a more plant farm. There was less grocery stores in the last 100 to 200 years, so that's a relatively new thing as far as when you look at a 100 or 200 time frame versus back then they already had lawyers, they already had tax collectors, they're paying taxes. So a grocery store would be relatively new, and you look in the last 50 years. Legal services is old, so it's also got a lot more competition, and so it'd be harder to make it, including like when you do your digital marketing on the internet, it'd be harder to get on the first page because there's so many people trying to do it. Okay, when we come back, after you've done this 3 to 6 month research, I want you to come back and watch step 7, which is the next video, to go over uses of your research, what to do with the data you have found.